Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, what we're going to talk about, do two-term presidents experience a second-term curse? This idea that presidents have noticeably worse second terms for their records and their legacies than they do for their first terms. Donald Trump has started his second presidential term, joining the ranks of presidents who experienced more than a first 4 years in office. And many political observers of various political stripes, however, have remarked in the past about this so-called second term curse whenever a president starts another term. Might be because of scandals, some sort of disaster, obstinacy from Congress to the president's agenda, economic downturns, Supreme Court cases unfavorable to that president's policy, and so on and so forth. But is this second term curse real? Is there really a rule that second terms for presidents are usually, if not always, worse for their reputations? Maybe it's a matter of survivorship bias, where presidents who did well in their first term are more likely to have a second term. So it is easier for a second term to look worse in comparison, sort of a regression to the mean, where if your first term was so great, it's hard to top that. Or maybe other government officials and the public just get sick of the guy in charge after more than 4 years and just want something different. There are a lot of data points you could point to make your case for or against the theory of the second term curse, but in any case, we're going to examine various data points, including presidential approval ratings and how the president's party has fared in certain elections. And when applicable, we'll then compare these points to Donald Trump's first term and his second term so far. So, let's dive in. So first off, who are the second-term presidents in U.S. history? Now, this list includes people who did not serve 2 full terms, but they went over 1 full term. The full 2-term presidents there's 14 of them. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, Grover Cleveland was the first guy to serve non-consecutive terms as president. Now Donald Trump is joining him. Woodrow Wilson, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who actually went into the beginning of a 4th term, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Now, some unfortunately died shortly into their second terms. Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley both were assassinated shortly after they started their second term. Richard Nixon resigned during his second term following the infamous Watergate scandal. And then some presidents that served over 1 full term took over during the previous president's first term. Teddy Roosevelt after William McKinley was assassinated, and then Lyndon B. Johnson after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And then a couple just took over for the previous president following the previous president's health-related death. So Calvin Coolidge took over after Warren Harding died, and Harry Truman took over after FDR died in office. Now, most of these presidents are during the existence of the Republican Party, because the Republican Party has only been around since the 1850s. So therefore, most of these presidents are going to be when politics turned into Democrats versus Republicans. But 2-term presidents before the existence of the Republican Party were George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and Andrew Jackson. And technically, George Washington did not serve a 2 full terms. That's just because there were some logistical issues since he was the first president, trying to get him into office. So he technically did not serve as long as other 2 full-term presidents, but for all intents and purposes, he served for 2 full terms. He didn't resign or pass before the end of his second term. The Federalist Party never officially had a 2-term president. Technically, George Washington was a Federalist. He never officially identified as such, but he tended to side with them on policy issues, particularly with Alexander Hamilton. And the Whig Party was, they never had a president serve a full term because they had a penchant for dying early. William Henry Harrison died a month into his term, and then Zachary Taylor died about a year and a half into his term. And then John Tyler took over for William Henry Harrison, and then Millard Fillmore took over for Zachary Taylor to fill out the rest of those respective presidents' terms. So, now into the actual data points on these two-term presidents as to whether there is a second-term curse. We'll first talk about their presidential approval ratings. Now, this has not been around since the very beginning of the nation. In fact, the presidential approval rating has only really been around since towards the end of FDR's tenure. And it's been refined over time, but the approval rating as we know it has only been around since then. And Gallup, the polling organization Gallup, has done it since then. It was the first one to do it since then. There are other organizations that also measure presidential approval rating, but Gallup is usually considered the one to go to because they have been doing it for so long. And so, because it is a relatively new thing that has been started, we're only going to be able to examine 8 presidents here that fit this criteria of 2 terms. So, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Now, Truman, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, the acronym that he often goes by, or is often treated by. Richard Nixon, those 3 did not serve 2 full terms, but for the purposes of this particular data, they can be treated the same here, because we're just looking at the highest percentage approval rating, lowest percentage approval rating, and the average percentage approval rating for both their first and second terms. And this data comes from the American Presidency Project's repository of Gallup's presidential approval rating poll. Bottom line here is that 2-term presidents have generally polled worse in presidential approval ratings in their second term compared to their first term. 6 of 8 of these presidents, so before Trump, because obviously he hasn't been in office much for a second term to really compare, but 6 of the 8 presidents we mentioned earlier, again, those being Truman, Eisenhower, LBJ, Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama. 6 of 8 of these presidents had a lower average approval rating in their second term than in their first term, the exceptions here being Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. 5 of 8 of them had a lowest percentage in their second term than in their first term. So in other words, they had a lower trough in approval rating in their second term than at any point that they had in their first term. Exceptions to this being Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Barack Obama had a 40% in both terms, so had about the same depth in approval rating for both terms in his case. And then 5 of 8 of these presidents had a lower highest percentage approval rating in the second term than in the first term, except Bill Clinton. Nixon had a 67% approval rating at some point in both of his terms, and then Ronald Reagan had 68% at both points, or at some point in both of his terms. So Donald Trump, how does he compare so far? So the average throughout his first term was 40%, lower than any president who served 2 full terms since the presidential approval rating poll was created. That was 7 points lower than Bill Clinton, who had an average of 47% in his first term, and he was the next lowest first term average after Donald Trump. Now, while most presidents have had a lower second term average than their first term, there's not much room for that to happen to Donald Trump. His second term being non-consecutive might also impact the rating, as opposed to if his second term was consecutive to the first term, but we'll have to see. And it wasn't around when the presidential approval rating wasn't around when Grover Cleveland was in office, so we can't really use that as a comparison point. And that was also a much longer time ago, so it might not be all that comparable anyways. But in any case, obviously we'll have to see what happens with Donald Trump, but he could become one of the exceptions where his second term presidential approval rating was higher than his first term. We'll have to see. Now let's talk about second term presidents and their party in congressional elections. Basically, looking at the net gains and losses of seats by the president's party in first versus second terms in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. So the first term being the first presidential election, the one that they got elected in the first time, and the first midterm following that presidential election, and then the second term being the second time that president got elected, and the second midterm that they experienced during their tenure. And for fair comparisons, we're only going to use presidents that served 2 full terms, since there have been 435 U.S. House seats, which there are now, and 100 U.S. Senate seats, which are now, except for FDR, since there were 96 U.S. Senate seats throughout his whole tenure, so it's pretty comparable. But the reason why before that I don't really want to use those or previous presidents before then is because the total number of U.S. House representatives and U.S. senators shifted a lot in those previous years and during presidency. So I don't think it would be really fair to compare unless you took like maybe percentages of the chambers. But even then, that gets a little bit maybe not quite an apples to oranges comparison, but the comparison does become more difficult. And so we're also presidents that serve more than 1 full term, but not 2 full terms. They don't have enough federal elections for fair comparison to presidents with 2 full terms, because they might not have had that first presidential election to compare, because if they took over for a previous president during that president's first term, then they only got elected 1 time. So they might have taken over 2 years into the previous president's presidency, and maybe even after that midterm, but then they only had 1 time that president got elected themselves. So for fair comparison, only presidents that had 2 full terms. So ones like Lyndon B. Johnson are not going to be included in here. And you have to be careful with U.S. Senate seats in comparisons, because only a third of the chamber is up for election in a given year. So one president's party may have more seats to defend than another president has to deal with. But in any case, that's just a caveat to keep in mind. We're still going to use it for a comparison point. So the presidents examined here, we only have 6 that are going to be examined here. So FDR, Eisenhower, Reagan, Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama. Bottom line here is it's kind of mixed results as to whether the president's party has lost more seats overall in their second term than in their first term. So 3 of 6 presidents saw their party lose more seats in the U.S. House in their second term than they did in their first term. So that was FDR, Eisenhower, W. Bush, FDR being a Democrat, Eisenhower and W. Bush being Republicans. 4 of 6 presidents saw their party lose more seats in the U.S. Senate in their second term than they did in their first term, that being FDR, Eisenhower, Reagan, and Obama. For all 6 of these presidents, however, there was a net loss in total U.S. Senate seats in the second term, except for FDR, who had a net change of 0 seats during his second term. So that's including his second reelection and then the midterm that followed that reelection. So, Donald Trump, how does he compare so far? So for the U.S. House, during his first term, he had a net loss of 46 seats. And so far in his second term, he had a net loss of 2 U.S. House seats. Only president that had a lower that had a greater net loss in seats in his first term was Bill Clinton, who lost 62 seats. And Donald Trump was just ahead of Barack Obama for a first term, and Obama had lost 40 seats in his first term in the U.S. House. As for the U.S. Senate, he had a net gain of 0 seats in the U.S. Senate for his first term, and so far has gained 4 seats in the U.S. Senate for his second election. His first term is tied with Eisenhower and is ahead of Clinton, who had a net loss of 8 seats, and W. Bush, who had a net loss of 2 seats. Now, the second term has started off well for Donald Trump so far for the U.S. Senate, but even for other presidents that started off well in the U.S. Senate or at least their party started off well in that president's second term, the next midterm really tanked their party representation. So we'll have to see how 2026, the midterm elections then, how they shape up for Donald Trump and the Republican Party. Now, let's look at how second-term presidents compare in regards to their partisan majorities in Congress. So not specific numbers of seats won or lost, but simply which party kept or won the partisan majority in Congress. So again, first term being that president's first election and then the first midterm during their presidency, and then the second term being their presidential election they got reelected in, and then the midterm following that, their second midterm. So for fair comparisons, we're going to use only the 15 presidents that served 2 full terms, so we can see how partisan majorities in Congress changed or stayed the same for all 4 elections they are around for. That first presidential election, first midterm, second presidential election, second midterm. And we can use the presidents that came that came before it was Democrat versus Republican. The 14 presidents here: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses Grant, Cleveland, Wilson, FDR, Eisenhower, Reagan, Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama. So remember, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson served before the Republican Party was created in the 1850s. Bottom line here is it's a bit complicated, as there is a noticeable difference when you account for politics prior to the emergence of the Republican Party and then after, in terms of whether a president in their second term faced more opposing partisan majorities in either chamber of Congress compared to their first term. So overall stats: 8 of 14 presidents saw their party win or hold the majority in the U.S. House fewer times in their second term than in their first term. So second term curse, a little bit iffy in that regard. And 8 of 14 presidents saw their party win or hold the majority in the U.S. Senate fewer times in their second term than they did in their first term. Not necessarily the same 8 presidents as for the U.S. House, though. However, much of that is due to the weakness of the Federalist Party following John Adams' loss in his presidential reelection bid. And then Andrew Jackson, when he became president, it was a one-party system. It was just Democrats, although they were definitely riven by factions, but it was still technically one party during then. So that's part of the reason why you didn't really see partisan majorities change all that much prior to the emergence of the Republican Party, at least in this context. So, since politics became Democrat versus Republican, 7 of 9 presidents saw their party win or hold the majority in the U.S. House fewer times in their second term than in their first term. And 6 of 9 presidents saw their party win or hold the majority in the U.S. Senate fewer times in their second term than in their first term. So when you put it in that context of Democrat versus Republican, definitely seems to be a sort of second term curse at play here. But Donald Trump, how does he compare so far? So in his first term, the majority party of the U.S. House was the same as his, Republican, for 2 years, and then following that, his first midterm, it became Democratic for the other 2 years. Now, starting off his second term, it's back to being Republican again, or rather, Republicans held their majority. So at least so far, the second term curse doesn't seem to apply to Trump in regards to majority party control in the U.S. House. In the U.S. Senate, however, the majority party has been the same as Trump's each time so far. So if Republicans lose the U.S. Senate majority in the 2026 elections, you could maybe argue that there's a second term curse in that regard. So another big data point we're going to look at here. This one's a little bit more finicky, I guess you could say. We're going to look at scandals / major negative events. Now, obviously, big thing for me here, trying to be as impartial as possible. I'm not passing judgments on presidents saying they were or they weren't at fault for these problems, just that these scandals and negative events became associated with them. Second terms for presidents, though, have also often been marked by major scandals, though they've happened in first terms for presidents too. There's just too many potential scandals and image-damaging events to cover here, and to compare numbers between first and second terms. Not really at least from what I've gathered, there's not really a concrete study into how many scandals a president has experienced in their first term versus their second term. But I will highlight some notable second term problems here for both parties. So, a couple of Democrats and then a couple of Republicans. Franklin Roosevelt. He had his what came to be called a court packing plan. It was legislation he was pushing to add that would have allowed him to add a new SCOTUS justice for each justice that reached 70 years old and did not retire. And that would have given him up to a maximum of 6 more justices. It was 9 then, still 9 now. But it was 9 justices then, and then that would have become 15 on the court. Now, that legislation failed, and he lost a lot of support, though he'd still win a third term as president and keep majorities in both chambers of Congress, at least for a little while. Now we fast forward a couple decades later. Lyndon Johnson, at the time, the Vietnam War was raging, and public opinion was starting to sour a bit on it. But then when the Tet Offensive hit, which was a surprise attack from North Vietnamese forces, that was a major catalyst for fully turning, not fully, but turning a lot more public opinion against the Vietnam War. And the progress of the Vietnam War, including the Tet Offensive, was one of the biggest reasons that Lyndon B. Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968, which he could have actually done under the 22nd Amendment, because even though he had served a couple of years before that full term that he won, under the 22nd Amendment, you can actually serve a maximum of 10 years as president. You would have had to have taken over for a previous president no earlier than halfway through that president's term. So JFK had just gone over a couple of years. Lyndon B. Johnson finished out close to 2 years there, won a full term there, so he actually served 6 years. Could have run again for another term to become president for 10 years, but he chose not to, and very likely would not have won if he did run for re-election, because his approval was sagging quite a bit. Now, the guy who took over after Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, we have the infamous Watergate scandal, which we mentioned earlier on, where there was a break-in of Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate Hotel by high-level members of the Nixon administration. And now every scandal has to have gate at the end of its nickname because we're very unoriginal and can't just call something a word without gate at the end. It's called the Watergate Hotel. They didn't add gate just because they could. Anyways, that's just another gripe of mine. I can't stand when all these controversies and scandals need to have gate at the end of it. We don't need gate at the end of every one of them. In any case, Richard Nixon resigns not too long after the Watergate scandal really comes to light. And then, about 7 years after, Ronald Reagan comes into office, but during his second term, so even later than that, you had the Iran-Contra affair, and senior officials in Reagan's administration secretly sold weapons to Iran while it was under an arms embargo. And the reason they were selling arms to Iran was so they could use the proceeds from those arms sales to fund the Contras, who were an anti-communist group in Nicaragua fighting the ruling Sandinistas who had just seized power in that country. Now, Reagan was never implicated, but it was a stain on his second term, although his approval rating did go back up toward the end of his tenure. So, just a few examples of major second-term scandals that presidents of both parties have experienced. Not saying that they were or weren't responsible for any of them, but they did happen and they did become synonymous with those presidents. Now, so to end things off before the actual ending of this episode, is there a second-term curse? Based just on the data we just talked about? Kinda. Presidents have generally polled worse in their second term overall than in their first term. They've also usually faced opposing partisan majorities in Congress more often in their second terms than in their first term, since politics became primarily Democrat versus Republican. The data, though, is more mixed when you're looking at specific numbers of seats gained or lost in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, comparing second term versus first term in that context. And for scandals, again, there's no concrete study, at least to my knowledge, that demonstrates presidential scandals are more common or damaging in second terms than in first terms. Though one might suspect that the second term would see more of those, because if they were more common in the first term, that president would have been much less likely to win a second term. But we can't really say for sure. But what do others have to say? I want to highlight several other viewpoints in this regard, because the second term curse, while it gets bandied about a lot of times, it's not a consensus opinion that second terms for presidents are more challenging than their first terms, or that there's an actual curse. Though I will note that several of these viewpoints I am highlighting came from 2013, so they may have changed since then, but a couple of the people that would say the second term curse theory sucks, or is a meh concept at least. Nate Silver, statistician, founder of 538, to quote him, "My view then is that the idea of the second term curse is sloppy as an analytical concept. There is certainly a historical tendency for presidents who earn a second term to become less popular, but some of this reflects reversion to the mean. Again, this idea that their first term was so great, and that's why they got a second term, but it's hard to top the first term, so the second term is going to look worse in comparison, generally speaking, because they're usually not going to have two incredible terms to point to. They're going to run into some sort of roadblock." Michael Barone, historian, commentator, and one of the authors of the Biennial Almanac of American Politics, quote from him, "Second-term problems result in more often from the failure to adjust to changed circumstances and unanticipated challenges." More basically, the president doing it to himself, having a worse second term than a first term, so really has nobody to blame but himself. Now, some people would still call that a curse, but in any case, Michael Barone is kind of skeptical of that concept. Now, those who would say the second term curse is real, or at least has some merit, you have Ron, and I'm hoping I'm saying this right, Fauchu, political analyst, newsletter writer, and pollster. He says, for starters, popular mandates tend to dissipate over time, and public familiarity tends to curdle into boredom or contempt. Second terms often lack purpose and are tarnished by missteps, scandals, and hubris. So, at least in his eyes, it seems that the second term curse theory has some merit and data backing it. And then there was a 2013 Economist article for presidents, and I'm using a chart from there. So for presidents from 1901 to 2009, and that chart reports that second terms for presidents in that time frame saw noticeably worse performance in various economic indicators, including industrial production, federal debt, GDP, the stock market, household income, and real house prices. Real meaning if you were to compare house prices, regardless of when you're accounting for inflation, real house prices were worth less in second terms. So it seems the jury is still out as to whether there is truly a second term curse, but nevertheless, some helpful insights into second term performance for presidents compared to their first terms. And that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Let's end off on a random fact of the day. So, today's random fact of the day. Donald Trump joined Grover Cleveland as the only presidents to serve non-consecutive terms in U.S. history. But did you know quite a few other prominent offices in American politics have also seen non-consecutive term occupants as well? There's a lot of those that we can point to, but just some examples here. Some of the examples include the following. For speakers of the U.S. House, we've had 7 people that have served non-consecutive terms as the Speaker of the U.S. House. The very first Speaker, who was also the third Speaker, Frederick Muhlenberg. Then we also had Henry Clay, who was a prominent political figure in his time beyond just being a Speaker, also a presidential candidate at least once or twice. He had 3 different stints as a Speaker. There was also John W. Taylor, Thomas B. Reed, Sam Rayburn, who is one of the most consequential speakers in U.S. history. He had 3 different stints as Speaker. And interspersed between his stints was Joseph W. Martin Jr. And then the most recent non-consecutively serving Speaker of the U.S. House, Nancy Pelosi. Supreme Court justices, despite being lifetime appointments, there have been a couple members that have served non-consecutive terms, and both also became Chief Justice upon their second stint. We had John Rutledge, who was one of the original SCOTUS justices, Supreme Court of the United States, and the second Chief Justice of the United States, although did not serve long in that capacity at all. He, in fact, I think was about 4 months as a Chief Justice, and then when he served as just an Associate Justice, it was only a couple years. So he didn't serve all that long in the Supreme Court. And then we also had Charles Evans Hughes, who was Chief Justice during part of the Herbert Hoover presidency and for much of the Franklin Roosevelt presidency. And then lastly, a bunch of governors, including Walter J. Hickel for Alaska. He had about 21 years between stints. A handful of Alabama governors served non-consecutive terms, including George Wallace, who had 3 different stints. You may recognize that name as an ardent segregationist who stood on the steps of the University of Alabama to prevent black students from attending the school, although he at least supposedly renounced his segregationist views later on during his life. Jerry Brown of California, he had about 28 years between stints. And then Terry Branstad of Iowa, he is actually the longest serving governor in U.S. history, not just Iowa history, but in all of U.S. history. serving from 1983 to 1999, and then again from 2011 to 2017. So that is going to do it for today's podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share with your networks and your friends and your family, even any random strangers that you know. Share it with them, please. And links in the show notes for my Facebook, LinkedIn, my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive, and Matchmaker FM profile, where you can have me as a guest on your podcast or possibly even be a guest on my podcast. And that's going to do it. So, as always, thank you again for listening. And until next time, take care.